Welcome to It Started With a Kick, the podcast in which well-known fans and high-profile figures from the world of football talk about the first match they ever attended. I'm your host, Richard Foster, and I'm absolutely delighted to introduce today's guest, Ali Bruce Ball. Ali is a familiar voice to nearly all of you, I'd hope, as one of the main football commentators on BBC Radio 5 Live, covering Premier League, Champions League, World Cup, and Euros. He also hosts BBC's Fantasy 606 podcast with another podcast guest we've had on here, Mr. Chris Sutton, and also Statman Dave. Ali can turn his hand to commentary on nearly any sport you like, but is particularly specialised in golf and has only just recently returned from the Masters. So, Ali, a warm welcome to the show. And let's start with that all-important first match, which was back in February 1985.
Yes, thank you, Richard. Delighted to be on. I've really enjoyed listening to the podcast so far in this series, yeah, some of the tales that others have had to tell. It just takes you back. And actually, funnily enough, with all the football that I have now covered, in a professional sense for the BBC, it's actually really nice to go back and sort of remember games when you weren't attending matches for work, because that's quite a rare thing. So yes, February 1985 was a very sort of brief dip of the toe in the water. So my brother and I were big football fans. So in 85, I would have been 12. We moved to Cambridge to start a new school in 1980. And that's when I remember I was really starting to get into my football. So the obvious place to go and watch the first game locally was the Abbey Stadium at Cambridge United. Although by that time, I was already an Ipswich Town fan. So my memories of going to that Cambridge United game against Newport County was very much a sort of, let's go and find out what watching a professional football match is all about, and we'd obviously said to mum and dad, can we go to Ipswich? Can we go to Ipswich? Can we go to Ipswich, please? But this was sort of the stepping stone towards doing that. And I'll tell you what, Richard, the funny thing is, quite often when I speak about, growing up and getting into this job in particular, I will always credit my mum, who has played a massive part in me ending up doing what I'm doing. It was my mum who said to me as I left university without having a clue as to what I wanted to do for a job. She was the one who said, how about sports journalism? You've always loved sport and you love talking. And I'd never ever even contemplated it until that point. So I always thank her to this day for that. But I also have to thank her because she was the one who took us to Cambridge United against Newport County. It wasn't my dad that took us to our first game. And I'm not saying anyone should necessarily be surprised by that, but on a Saturday, dad would have been around. He worked very hard in the week, but it was mum who ended up taking us. And she still she holds that as a badge of honor still, that she was there with me and my brother at our very first game.
That's excellent. And actually, through the pods that I've done so far, there are a huge amount, the vast majority of people, their dads weren't into football, so they either went with a friend or a family friend, whatever it might have been, and it's a common theme. But your mum stepped up to the plate, so well done.
Yeah,
Ali's mum.
Well, we'd be similar though, Richard. My mum and dad were keen for us to have as many experiences as we possibly could, and we both love sport, but they weren't into football. Football wasn't a thing in our family. We didn't grow up and get told, right, you're Ipswich fans right from the start, or you're Tottenham fans, or you're Arsenal fans. It just wasn't a thing. But as soon as we expressed an interest, I think there was a little bit of a reticence. I heard Jim White saying this to you the other day in one of the podcasts. Given the nature of attending football matches in that era and the potential of hooliganism and violence, my parents were definitely wary of taking us to games just for the pure safety reasons. So we didn't actually go that often. We quite often played sport ourselves on a Saturday rather than attending sport. But when we got the chance to do it, we we loved it.
Brilliant. And let's look at the game. I know your memories aren't exactly, you can take us through every minute as you would do through a football commentary, but what are your memories of that game? And I've done a little bit of research, so I know a little bit more about it.
Okay, I've had a very little look at sort of the game, the date. Cambridge United then, which were Division 3, weren't they? But I think they were relegated that season. They were not in a good moment, as the football managers like to say.
No, I did check. Sorry, I did check Cambridge's record that season. I think they were actually bottom of the division by the end of it by something like 23 points. So that was even, that's an interesting place to start, is the basement of Division 3. But tell us more about the game.
Yeah, I mean, it's really vague recollections, Richard. And actually, when we come on to my first Ipswich game, that is slightly clearer in my head. But what I remember is definitely the excitement of just walking through the car park and up to the stadium and through the old-fashioned turnstiles and just coming into my first ever football stadium for a professional match. I remember sitting very close to the pitch, for whatever reason, and it might be my mind playing tricks on me. I felt we were very close to the players' tunnel. I seem to remember the players coming out of the tunnel, going back into the tunnel, almost feeling like we could sort of reach out and touch them. You might be able to tell me this, Richard, if you've looked into the game. I've got a feeling there was quite a bad injury in that game. I seem to remember one of the Cambridge United players getting injured and taken off, and it being quite close to us, and it feeling quite brutal and feeling quite visceral and physical. And I was really struck by that element. So, I played football in the playground and watched the occasional game on television. But I think a bit like when you go to if you've ever been to a boxing fight, the first time I ever did that, I was really struck by the brutality of it and the physical nature of it. And I think that sticks with me from that Cambridge United game. I want to say that the names I remember from the team sheet, and again, this could be completely wrong. Steve Spriggs, Cambridge United. And was he the one that got injured? I'm not sure. And Lindsay Smith for Newport, possibly.
Yes.
Is that right?
Yes. Well, I couldn't track down the lineups, which is very, very poor of me, I must admit. Steve Spriggs definitely rings a bell. And Lindsay Smith, I knew a Cambridge fan, and I actually went to watch Cambridge at Highbury playing Arsenal in the FA Cup. And there was a big chant about Lindsay Smith, and it was all to do with, you did this in the crowd, you went moose. I'm not quite sure. We probably need to get Lindsay Smith on the podcast, if he's still around, to explain that. But as I said, I couldn't quite track down the lineups. But what did interest me is, do you remember the scorers in the game? Probably not.
No, my memory would be I've seen the result, but before I looked it up, Richard, I remember that Cambridge lost. I mean, I don't remember vociferously supporting Cambridge in a way which I feel slightly disloyal, considering it was where I live. But again, because I think I was already an Ipswich Town fan, it very much felt to me like like a trip to find out what this was all about, and like a sort of almost like a neutral observer in a way, if you can be that as like an 11-year-old, 12-year-old boy. But Cambridge, I probably, like most games that season, they lost the game, didn't they? I think they 2-1. Scored 2-1. Yeah.
So I mean, I think that's really interesting that you went to your first. Most people go to their first game with the club that they support or end up supporting. But in a way, this is written in the stars that you would become a football commentator, because you've got to be neutral and you've got to be objective. So there's your first game. It's not Ipswich, it's Cambridge. So the one thing that struck me about the players who scored that day, so for Cambridge, the guy who scored is called Tom Finney. And I'm going to
Really?
point out here, not anything to do with the Preston plumber and the great player. And the player who scored twice for Newport, check this out, Neville Chamberlain.
Yes.
Not connected to the ex-Prime Minister during World War II, or the start of it anyway.
Now, as soon as you said that, just before you said Neville Chamberlain and you said someone scored 2 goals, I was about to, now that has come back to me. That has come back to me originally. I don't know whether he was he brother of Mark Chamberlain, who played for Stoke.
I'm not sure. I remember Mark Chamberlain. I must admit, I don't remember Neville Chamberlain.
I think he was, but I will check that afterwards.
Yeah.
But that's funny, isn't it? So that really has just smacked me in the face. That as soon as you said that, again, I couldn't picture the goals, but as soon as you said someone scored 2 goals, I would have got that right, and maybe because of the name, potentially because of that name.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty good that you've got Tom Finney and Neville Chamberlain scoring in the first games. So Cambridge, I went to Cambridge a few times as a Palace fan, famously for the FA Cup quarter-final in 1990, when Jeff Thomas scored a screamer. Well, it wasn't a screamer, it actually bobbled in. But I do remember the ground being very tight, and the away end was really quite small. And I don't know if I'm making this up, but was there a sort of cabbage patch at the back, or is that something that I've added to embellish my story of going to the Abbey Stadium?
I couldn't say definitively, although again, with you saying that, Richard, that feels right. I mean, funnily enough, again, just talking about this and sort of memories vaguely coming back to me, talking about walking up to the stadium and walking through those turnstiles and in, I think I do remember as excited as I was about, being in there for my first ever game, possibly being slightly underwhelmed by the surroundings because all the football I'd seen up to that point, would have been at bigger grounds, at Division 1 grounds in terms of watching on the television. So I remember thinking, "Oh, right, I didn't quite imagine it like that." But you're probably right. You're probably right. And now I'm just trying to think, our seat, if we were tunnel side, which can you remember which end you'd have been at then as the Palace fan?
Well, it was uncovered, definitely. Yeah. As I say, it wasn't very big. Jeff Thomas scored the goal at our end. I do remember that bit, but I couldn't tell you. I assume the other end, I think, would be the home supporters, because I think they had a roof. So the away supporters usually didn't get any comforts like roofs or anything like that. So I would imagine that was the end. As I say, I don't know the compass points, but it was definitely uncovered.
My memory of it is, as you walk through that old car park, and I've not been back there for years. My parents don't live there anymore, so I go to Cambridge occasionally, but I've not been there for a long time. Is that as you walk through that car park, the first stand you hit is at one of the ends of the ground. So the other end, I'm guessing, would have been the away end. And actually, you are in Fenland there, in terms of Cambridge and what surrounds it. So it's very likely that behind that stand, because at one end, the end you're talking about, I think, Richard, you'd have the main road, the car park, and into the ground you went. And at the other end, I wouldn't be at all surprised if that was cabbage patch, fens, whatever behind it.
Yeah. And the atmosphere. So, as you say, it's slightly underwhelming because you're going to a game that's got 1,600 people in it. It's not exactly, as you say, you watch on television, you see big crowds and big stadiums, and then suddenly you're thrust into it firsthand. You're going, this isn't quite what I expected. But did you have any awareness of, chanting or the atmosphere? I mean, I can't imagine there would have been many Newport fans in that cabbage patch end, if it is indeed the cabbage patch end.
Yeah. Don't remember the away fans particularly. And, given the season Cambridge were having, I can't imagine, the fans were that buoyant. What I would say to that question, Richard, is that I was struck a few years ago when I took my boys to their first football match, which was at Salisbury City, which is obviously non-league football and, quite small and rudimentary. And what struck me about that day is my my younger son is sports mad, loves his football, into everything. My elder boy, not at all. But I'm really keen that he just gets the experience of attending live sporting events, because I always think there's more to be taken out of them than just the sport itself. You know,
Yeah.
the people, the food, the smells, you know, whatever.
Mm.
And what struck me about that day was when you're in a smaller crowd like that, you hear pretty much every, not necessarily chanting, but just, you know, little bit of abuse slung at opposition goalkeeper or conversation between a couple of fans. And funnily enough, that day at Salisbury, that's what my elder son took away from it, was the opposition keeper. He was very, very amused by this group of 4 or 5 fans who were giving this keeper absolutely heaps, with a little bit of industrial language in there. And so he's only sort of 12 years old at the time, and that's a bit naughty and, you know, and excited for him. But so I imagine at Cambridge that would have been similar for me in terms of, you know, I don't remember being hit by an atmosphere or lots of sort of you know, chanting that rung around the ground. That's not a memory for me of that first game.
No, and as I pointed out in this pod before, I also enjoy going to non-league football. Team I follow is actually Hendon, who have quite a rich history. Actually, they've been to Wembley a few times. But as you say, you go to the game, and I don't know if this is the thing with non-league football, but there are 5 fans whose concentration is just winding the opposition goalkeeper up. And when you change ends, they follow him, and then they give him exactly the same as they have done in the first half, which I think must be a little bit disconcerting when you're a keeper, or maybe you just get used to it. So Cambridge, interesting that day. I mean, you might have been focusing on this a little bit more. Ipswich, your team, beat Norwich, the rivals, East Anglia rivals, in a League Cup semi-final first leg, which, considering it was on a Saturday, is quite odd. But I don't know whether you were tuning in on your radio or you weren't that obsessed as an Ipswich fan yet.
Yeah, no, very aware of those games. I mean, don't remember being aware of that game on that day, and I'm sure we would have pushed to try and go to that if we could. But obviously, what I do remember about that is that is the year that they beat us in the semi-finals of the League Cup, and then go on to win the League Cup by beating Sunderland with a Gordon Chisholm own goal. I mean, that's crazy. Well, I think it was an Asa Hartford shot that hit Gordon Chisholm and ended up in the back of the net. And, you know, as an Ipswich fan, and Richard, I've never been massively into, I quite enjoy, I mean, Ipswich having a terrible time against Norwich at the moment. And actually, there's a very real chance they meet each other in the playoffs this season, which I know Ipswich fans are utterly dreading. But I've never really got into the wanting the other team to fail. You'd always enjoy coming out on the right end of the rivalry. And actually, back in the day, I remember a time when, for 5 Live, when we had 2 commentators per game, we did Ipswich Norwich games with me and Mike Sewell, who's a Norwich fan, sharing the commentary. And then Brian Hamilton, who's been involved with both clubs, would sit in between us. So you sort of had partiality and impartiality kind of all at the same time. But I've never massively got into. I remember feeling slightly disappointed. I mean, obviously devastated that we got knocked out in the semi-final. But when Norwich went on to win it, not being massively bothered by that. And I think Ipswich fans would always try and say, "Well, look, we've won the top flight title in the '60s. We've won the FA Cup. We've won the UEFA Cup. We've still got all that to shout about." So, but that's funny, isn't it? That game was played on a Saturday.
Yeah, it did surprise me. And as you say, unfortunately, Ipswich lost the second leg 2-0, and as you say, Norwich went on to beat Sunderland in the final. I'm sure Chris Sutton will be pointing this out when he hears this pod. And it's a bit weird, isn't it? How, I mean, Ipswich now are in a tremendous place, and well, maybe they won't go into the playoffs. Maybe they'll go up automatically. Who knows? That top of that championship is utter madness. But we're going to touch on the playoffs later because, as you know, I've written a book about it and I always have to bring it up. And unfortunately for Ipswich fans, it's not a happy memory.
No.
But going back just to that game, and we are going to talk about Ipswich much more later. One thing I always ask people, and it's one thing that generally is impressed upon you in your first game, is the kits. So I can visualize the Cambridge kit, sort of amber and black. Was that something also? I must admit, I don't know what Newport would have worn. I think they do amber and black, so they would have been in their second strip. But is that something again that you have any memory of?
Yeah, definitely. And the sort of colours around the stadium and of the match programme matching that as well. But also thinking, again, if I was going to choose a football team, and in terms of picking Ipswich, I mean, in those days, you could have been accused of being a little bit of a glory hunter. So they were a hugely successful team in the late 70s, early 80s under Bobby Robson, which is just when we were getting into our football. So having moved to Cambridge, that we should really have been supporting Cambridge United. I should be a Cambridge United fan. But because Ipswich was so close, and actually we went to school with kids who had Ipswich connections and families who supported Ipswich, we definitely got carried along that way. And I think it was also a club we picked because, they were trying to take the fight to Liverpool. There were so many kids who were Liverpool fans because they were the utterly dominant team. You're obviously against Nottingham Forest and Villa and the likes as well, but they were still, Ipswich were pretty plucky underdogs in a way. Taking that fight to Liverpool. And I remember also, going back to your initial question here, Richard, liking the Ipswich kit. Blue is my favourite colour, and I think it was before I supported Ipswich, or maybe that's the other way round. But I remember going to Cambridge United and thinking, do you know what? If I was going to pick a football team, I remember thinking this inside the stadium on the day. That wouldn't be the colour. That's not the shirt I would want to wear, or the colours I'd want to wear. I'm just not particularly fond of the amber and black. I mean, if you support Cambridge United, you must love it. And if you're, a Wolves fan, I mean, I think that looks terrific actually at Molineux, the sort of old gold and black. But I just remember as a young lad that day thinking, no, not for me. Those colours, not for me.
They're not going to make the grade. One player actually for Newport, and I know he played this season for Newport, but I'm not absolutely sure because I haven't been able to trace the lineups for this specific match, was David Moyes.
Really?
Yep. Which amazed me because I didn't really know that he was involved. And apparently he played there between 83 and 85 with a guy called Alan Comfort and also Graham Daniels. Alan Comfort, I do remember.
Yeah.
Graham Daniels. And well, maybe he was, no, sorry, I think he was playing for Cambridge, forgive me. Apparently he fell out with a guy called Roy McDonough. Again, a name that triggers some sort of memory.
Yeah.
And the reason is because Alan Comfort, Graham Daniels and David Moyes were apparently very religious. And they used to almost get a Bible out and have a little Bible reading group before the games. And Roy McDonough, who, let's call him a traditional centre-back or, quite a hard man, apparently just turned around and said, we're in a relegation scrap with suitable blasphemy alongside it. Stop reading that ex-book. So, but David Moyes, watching David Moyes play, again, for me, what strikes me is he was a centre-back and he's not that tall a guy. But in the back of your mind when you were watching him, were you thinking, oh, that guy's going to be up to about 700 Premier League management appearances?
No. As soon as you said that,
no.
As soon as you said that, though, Richard, what my mind immediately takes me to there is, isn't it incredible that as an 11-year-old boy watching my very first football game, I watched someone who I then go on to interview countless times, but actually spend time with at the World Cup in 2010, working for BBC Radio 5 Live. We did a commentary in Ellis Park in Johannesburg, which is not a football venue, but one of the most atmospheric venues I've ever been in, and a stadium that carries an enormous amount of history. And so all those years later, so 85 to 2010, what are we talking, 25 years later, I'm sitting there next to him and we're commentating on Brazil against North Korea. That is utterly bonkers if you think about it. And funny enough, I had that same experience, and I get it very rarely, and it's always a treat when it happens. The one Ipswich Town game I've commentated on this season was in the FA Cup. 5 Live don't have the commentary rights to Championship football, so I don't get the chance to see Ipswich very often, but I did get the chance to see them lose to Maidstone in the FA Cup. So I saw one of the rare disappointing games this season. But I commentated on that game with Terry Butcher. And again, for me to be sitting alongside someone I used to absolutely adore, as a little kid, watching him play for my team, to sit alongside him and commentate with him on Ipswich Town, it just blows my mind, really. It's amazing.
Yeah, well, next time you do a commentary with David Moyes, he might have some more time on his hands in the near future, having been hammered by Palace on Sunday 5-2. Sorry, West Ham fans. Sorry to raise that again. Yeah, you could throw it in to say, do you realise I watched you back in 1985, Cambridge, Newport County? And maybe I don't know if he's one of those people who's got that memory, but I would assume players, and they play for lots of clubs, they generally have lots of appearances. He won't have a crystal clear memory of playing Newport, but you never know. And good segue here, because you mentioned Terry Butcher, and we are now going to move on to your first game at Portman Road, because he was a central figure in that. So tell us more about your first game at Portman Road.
Just before I do that, Richard, let me tell you this Terry Butcher story before I forget it, which is absolutely true. So I attended a PGL soccer school at the age of 7 near Ipswich. So me and my cousin, so we all grew up, me, my brother and my cousin, all grew up as Ipswich Town fans, had the kits, played football together, whatever. My cousin and I went on this soccer school. So it was in either the Easter holidays or the summer holidays, when your parents packed you off for a week, and it was football. Yeah. It was football morning, noon and night, and football and activities and whatever. And one of the attractions of this particular soccer school was that an Ipswich Town player would come along at one point during the week and come and coach you. Yeah. Terry Butcher turns up, which everyone is just, well, looking miles up into the air, because we're all tiny little 7-year-olds, but also wide-eyed in admiration. And he is there. We do a little bit of heading with him, which nowadays, actually, if you think about it, you wouldn't do that. The kids wouldn't be heading football, would they? Wouldn't be allowed, but we did. And at one point during this heading session, kind of for a joke, a ball comes in that is too high for me to get to, and Terry Butcher puts his hands underneath my armpits and lifts me up to attempt to head this cross. But as I pulled back to try and head the ball, I smash his nose with the back of my head. Now, it didn't draw blood. It wasn't England, Sweden or anything like that. No. But I was enormously apologetic. He wasn't bothered. He didn't even feel it. But then after that, I don't know if you remember, well, I'm sure you will, and loads of our listeners will remember this, Match Magazine. So Match Magazine used to have a section where you could write in with your claim to fame. If you were a reader, you could write in with your claim to fame. And my claim to fame was that I headbutted one of my heroes, Terry Butcher, and I still have the little clipping. So it appeared in Match Magazine of, that with my name underneath it, which was a real highlight, actually, of of growing up.
Well, I need to see a copy of that Match Magazine, so we can put that up to promote this episode. That would be brilliant. It's a pity, actually, that he didn't have the bloody headband after that, because that would have been, a memorable sight. So Terry Butcher, he played a pivotal role in this first game. So let's get into that.
Okay, so this is a year on from the Cambridge game that we've been talking about, but this definitely was my first Ipswich game, which was hugely exciting. This is an Ipswich Town team. So we're in the 85-86 season. So this is, I mean, that's the slightly disappointing thing, having supported them and got into them as a young kid, is that by the time I go to watch them live, that great team has been disassembled. Bobby Robson's gone off to manage England in 1982. They've won the UEFA Cup in 1981. They were runners-up to Liverpool again in 1982. Bobby Robson leaves, and then his longtime assistant, Bobby Ferguson, takes over. And they eventually got relegated in this season that I first went to watch them. But you could see it coming. It was a sort of gradual process. And if you look at the team sheet that day, you know, compared to the team sheet from the early 80s and names that everyone could rattle off, it was, you know, and not being unkind to these players, because I absolutely love these players, but in terms of the quality of player we had then and trying to find their way in Division 1, it was much more difficult. So this was Ipswich against Nottingham Forest, which is Brian Clough's Nottingham Forest, and one of the great memories of the day for me, and this is clear as day in my head, is after the game, which Ipswich did win by a goal to nil, is seeing the Nottingham Forest bus waiting to pull out of the Ipswich car park. And as we sort of walk across the pavement and look to our left, you look into the front window of the bus, and the bus driver is behind the wheel on the left-hand side as I'm looking at it. And there he is, Brian Clough, green jumper, looking grumpy as ever, because Nottingham Forest have obviously come and lost this game to Ipswich. And again, because of the figure he was in football, I just, you know, that picture is just seared into my brain as a happy young Ipswich fan who's attended their first game and watched Ipswich win.
Yeah, exactly. And actually, the first episode of this podcast, we had Darren Fletcher on, and we did go through Brian Clough quite rigorously for obvious reasons. So, as you say, again, I'm gonna pick you up here, Ali, because the first game you went to was Cambridge, who were getting relegated. The second game you went to was Ipswich; they're getting relegated. Basically, don't invite Ali to a first game at your ground, because your team will get relegated. But no. The teams, as you say, that this was transformed. Bobby Ferguson had taken over. What a tough job. Taking over from Bobby, I mean, it's impossible, isn't it? It is the impossible job. So Bobby Ferguson, when you're an assistant, I think it's interesting that you get pushed up the way. It very rarely works, from what I can remember. I can't remember many assistant managers then becoming good managers when they're thrust into the limelight.
No, but in this situation, Richard, it was, as you say, it was impossible. I mean, beyond expectations, really, what Bobby Robson and that Ipswich team achieved, and the group of players that they managed to put together. And actually, I think the following season, so the first season without Bobby Robson, I've got the feeling Ipswich still finished 5th, 6th, something like that. But it was a gradual decline, and players were sort of leaving bit by bit. So in this team that I watched that day, I just reminded myself of the team sheet. In terms of the 81 UEFA Cup winning team, you've only got the goalkeeper, Paul Cooper, and Terry Butcher left. And Terry Butcher leaves at the end of this season to go off to Rangers. But everyone else by then, Burley, Mills, Osman, Gates, Walk, Tyson, Muir, and Brazil, they've all gone. They've all gone by then. So it's a totally different team. But you know, the other thing, you're right, Richard, is, you know, you look at the success of the way that Liverpool sort of went from manager to manager via the boot room. This is what Ipswich are trying to do with Bobby Ferguson. He was with Bobby Robson since 1970 at Ipswich. I mean, he knew the club inside out, and it absolutely made sense. And I think the thing that I quite liked as well was that following relegation, nowadays you get the boot immediately, wouldn't you? But I think he had another season, Bobby Ferguson. They sort of said to him, right, come on, let's see what we can do in Division 2. Let's see if we can get back up. They then lost in the playoffs that following season, didn't get back up. And that was when Bobby Ferguson's time at Ipswich ended. And it took us a few years to get back up. It was John Lyle, actually, former West Ham manager, who eventually came in and then got Ipswich back up. But but no, incredibly tough job for Bobby Ferguson. That
Indeed. So looking at the team, as you say, I looked through the lineup, and there are some that jumped out at me, some that I didn't know that well. Paul Cooper, I do remember. I have this impression that he was quite a small guy.
yeah.
I mean, obviously every keeper nowadays is 6'8", so it's not relevant. But in those days, even then, Cooper looked quite small. It's maybe because there were so many goals flying past him that he relatively looked like he was not filling the goal, let's say. But he was a good keeper, wasn't he? I mean, he was a very solid keeper.
Yeah, no, he was a brilliant goalkeeper, and the famous stat about him, which I think a lot of the listeners will know, is that in one particular season in the top flight, he saved 8 out of 10 penalties, which I think is still a record,
right?
Which is which is remarkable. But you're right; I'd have to look up his exact height, but he was relatively short of stature. I picture him dark hair, sort of short, stocky, which doesn't seem right for a goalkeeper. But no, fabulous Ipswich Town player, Paul Cooper.
Absolutely. And another one that stands out for me, partly because he's got a great name, is Romeo Zondervan. Now, Dutch, and you can go back to the Dutch influence. Clearly, you mentioned Muren, Tyson, who came in and made a massive impact at Ipswich. And I was just thinking to myself idly when I was thinking about Dutch players who ended up at Ipswich. Was it because East Anglia is so close to the Netherlands and the hook of Harwich, get a ferry, or the other way round, and you're there?
Yeah.
That could be the case. But do you remember Romeo Zondervan? Because he became, a stalwart in that team, and eventually, I think he was, once you'd gone up again, I think he was the captain, but then he left. Yeah. So was he someone again? He had a great moustache. He looked like a Romeo.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, no, exactly. The look suited the name, didn't it? He was very distinctive looking. So jet black hair, curly hair, and the sort of black bushy moustache. I mean, we joke about him a little bit in our household because I say, Richard, that my dad isn't particularly a football fan. He sort of, got into it for us and took us to games. But he would engage, and still now, we celebrated his 80th birthday the other day, and every weekend we talk about, Ipswich results. But Romeo Zondervan was his favourite player. And he used to love, but then he moved on to Mickey Stockwell. And Mickey Stockwell did a similar job for Ipswich down that right-hand side, incredibly hard-working, up and down, hugely reliable, very, very loyal. And those are clearly sort of traits that my father must be attracted to in football players. So he didn't want the flashy stuff. He wanted the loyal fella that was going to give absolutely everything for the club. So yeah, Romeo Zondervan was a real hero for him.
And Terry Butcher, who we've mentioned, he was the captain, and he scored the only goal of the game.
Don't remember it. Don't remember the goal at all, Richard. And actually, I think your research has been better than mine, because when I looked it up, I thought it was a late winner. But I think you tell me it came quite early in the second half.
52nd minute in my annals. Maybe they're wrong, but I think I do rely on some pretty reliable sources. But
no, I'm sure you're right. Yeah, I mean, it must have been a difficult season for Terry as well, because, like I say, he's sort of one of the last great players there standing. Lots of younger players coming through around him. The club is struggling. Interest in him. He went off and had a hugely successful career up in Scotland as well. And he's a legend, isn't he? He's an Ipswich Town legend, Terry. He's still there every home game. I think he and Russell Osman, centre back pairing that was so brilliant for Ipswich, still hook up regularly. I think Russell's moved back to Ipswich as well. And when I went in for the Maidstone game the other day, so I've not been to Portman Road for such a long time. It was such a lovely experience going back actually this season, and it's not really changed that much, Richard. I don't think. I mean, like all football clubs, it's got a bit bigger and it's modernised, but it's modernised quite well in that it's sort of kept its character that I remember, the lovely family-run club that I believe it still is. But when we walked into the accreditation area that day, the first picture I saw was of Terry playing for England against Spain in the 1982 World Cup. And it's a picture of him. I don't know who he's tackling. It is the most horrendous tackle. 2 feet off the floor, knee high, nowhere near the ball, utterly committed. But when you walked in, you just thought, yeah, what a player. What a player.
Well, for that tackle, he might have just got a telling off by the ref, and it wouldn't have gone to VAR, so he'd have been fine. I know you're a big fan of quiz questions, so I'm gonna throw one at you, and I'm pretty convinced you're going to get this right. In fact, it's a two-part question. Terry Butcher was born in a very unusual place for a footballer. Where was that?
I'm going to say Singapore.
Very good. That's half a mark. Your
Okay.
second part of this question is, which other ex-footballer is his cousin?
Oh, I have no idea, Richard. I don't know.
And he is also a Five Live pundit as well.
Terry,
Try Pat Nevin.
really?
Well, I've seen it in several places. Maybe it's apocryphal, but I mean, I know Pat Nevin, so I might check with him. But
Yeah, so do I.
that is
So
what
do
that is the rumor that's out there. I
I.
don't quite England, Scotland. I don't know how it goes, but
Yeah.
yeah,
Well,
that was something.
yeah, and they obviously, I mean, A would have played against each other, and
Yeah,
B worked together at Motherwell when Pat
of
kind of
course, he was a
took his role
CEO,
at
wasn't
Motherwell.
he? Yeah.
That's right. So yeah, Motherwell, Terry Butcher was part of the coaching team there. So that makes sense. And I'm sure you're right, Richard. But do you know what? Funnily enough, having worked with the pair of them quite a lot, that's
Yeah.
never ever come up. So next time I'm
Wow.
going to be with Pat quite a lot this summer at the Euros because we'll be doing the
Awesome.
Scotland games together. So there's a good chance I think to sit down over a glass of red wine and talk families.
Excellent. Well, yeah, dig deep, dig deep. The other one who I suppose there are a couple of Ipswich players who also stand out for me is Mitch Davray. Again, great name. I don't think there are many Davrays who've played certainly in English football. And the other one was Jason Dezelle,
Oh
because
yeah,
I used to love watching him play because he had that elegance and the way of he always used to stand straight and run straight. And I
mm.
just think, because obviously his son then went on to play for Ipswich, and I think he's now at QPR. But Dezelle, I mean, you got some great names in here.
Mm.
But Dezelle was a great player. Do you remember him?
I do remember him. So he was my brother's. So that's the funny thing, Richard. So we all had our favourite players in
Yeah.
the in the famous team, shall I say, in inverted commas. So I was a Paul Mariner guy. Paul Mariner was my guy. My cousin was Russell Osman. Who was my brother's favourite player? I can't remember, but I remember my brother moved on to Jason Dezelle. So once those guys had left, we all then had to move on to the next players. Now I just couldn't go on to Mitch Davray because I was such a Paul Mariner fan, and I just thought Mitch Davray was never going to be as good as Paul Mariner. So
No.
I didn't pick him. But my brother picked Jason Dezelle, who got into that Ipswich team so young, but was one of those classic players I think probably because of his stature, like you described, Richard, even
Mm.
at the age of 15, 16, he looked much older. He played much older. He was, yeah, although he was tall and skinny, he was strong and carried himself, beautifully. And there was just a lot of expectation on him, with all those great players that had left. He was seen
Mm.
as the sort of next great Ipswich player, and he was a hugely talented footballer. I mean, really exciting to watch. But yeah, he was my brother's favourite by far and away.
Mhm. So you said that you got quite close to Brian Clough in the coach. Probably wouldn't have been a great time to do any autograph hunting because he was pretty grumpy. Do you remember many of the Forest players? Because you're a young lad, and you're not really going to probably pay that much attention to the team who your team are playing. There are some names that again jump out at me here, but Can you remember any of them
I
from that
I
game?
mean, if you reel them off, Richard, I will. But I've got to tell you that on the day, I was so excited about being at Ipswich for the first time that my attention was totally and utterly on, on everything Ipswich, not just the players, but the pitch, the stadium, the programs, the club shop, all of that. The Brian. I mean, like I say, the one image I really take away from the day is Clough at the front of the bus after they've lost the game. In terms of the players, I would probably know that Forest team quite well, but I don't remember. I don't remember specifically watching them that day and thinking, "Oh, there's so and so." I
Yeah,
mean, that's not that far on from their incredible double European Cup success, really, is it?
exactly.
It's 5 6 years on. So is there anyone left from that team from those teams in that team that day, or have they all moved on by then?
No, I mean the only one I can see here who was involved is Ian Bowyer.
Yeah,
So he was, with them, at that late 70s, early 80s, but none of the others I can see would have been involved. Steve
Franz.
Sutton was the
Oh
goalkeeper.
yeah, Steve. Something. Franz
Uh,
Carr. Did Franz Carr
Franz
play?
Carr, very good.
There
Should
we
I give
go.
you an extra point for Franz Carr? Um, Johnny Method. I mean, we're
Oh
talking
yeah,
about Dutch players. And
yeah,
again, when I did the Darren Fletcher episode, he talked about Johnny Method scoring some incredible
yeah.
goals. And, there's one goal that everyone remembers where literally the net is almost torn off. I think it was West Ham, wasn't it?
Yes. Now that goal, Richard, see, that takes me back to another brilliant football memory as a child, is that my brother and I watched again and again and again and again a video called 101 Great Goals. And it
Mhm.
started late 60s with a Jimmy Greaves goal, and it went all the way through to about 89, I think. I think it finished with an Ian Rush goal. The Keith Houchin diving header was in there sort of late on. But the
Mhm.
Johnny Method goal in there, I think it's the goal you're talking about, where and I think it's a dead ball. I think it's a free
It
kick,
is, yeah.
and he takes a
Yeah.
massive long run at it, and it just keeps rising, doesn't it? It sort of starts low, and then just like a brilliant goal shot, sort of launches itself into the air, and like you say, nearly takes the net off its mooring. And then the celebration was a real sort of wag, the same arm sort of go. I remember that. I remember that so well, actually. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, he did it a few times, but I think that one was the standout. You did have Des Walker at the
yeah,
back,
yeah.
um, and Neil Webb, and also Nigel Clough was in there.
Well, there you
So
go.
he was
Yeah.
probably hiding from Brian on the coach. What did you do, lad? What did you do?
Yeah, yeah. Well,
And then it
that's a
was finished off. Gone.
that's a good win for Ipswich. That, Richard. So that's a decent. There's some good players in that
Well,
Forest team.
exactly.
Yeah,
But I think it's interesting, as you say, because Forest, a little like Ipswich, had former glories, but this team was drifting. It didn't drop, but it drifted. And then, unfortunately for them in Clough's last season, they got relegated from the Premier League. But I mean, this is a few years off. But you could. It's not Forest in their prime, because Forest in their prime
oh,
were almost impossible to beat, and
totally.
Ipswich, as you say, were struggling and eventually did get relegated.